We saw that Nagasena is a Buddhist monk, but that King Milinda is a critic of Buddhist ideas. Let's take a moment to understand what kind of Buddhism we're encountering in this text and what its main commitments are. Unlike Hinduism, which is a much later term than the texts that we're working with, the English word Buddhism corresponds to terms in Sanskrit and Pali. The word Buddha in Sanskrit simply means an enlightened person, and it's more a title than a proper name. The particular enlightened person, or Buddha, that is historically responsible for Buddhism is known as Gautama, and he was a member of a royal class, by all accounts a prince. Buddhist scriptures and texts tell us that he left his royal life when he encountered sickness, old age, and death, and realized that life was inevitably full of suffering. A Buddhist is someone who follows this Buddha. Although Buddhists think there are many Buddhas who were born into this world at various times, in this lecture we'll talk about the historical Buddha, Gautama, who was a real person, according to most scholars, who lived sometime between the 5th and 6th century BCE. This Buddha became enlightened, or woke up, not just to the fact of suffering, but to its causes. Famously, after trying a range of existing practices which were around in his time, probably some of those discussed in texts like the Bhagavad Gita, he realized that existing approaches to suffering just didn't cut it. He sat under a Bodhi tree and he meditated until he achieved enlightenment, which allowed him to not only understand suffering and its causes, but to identify a solution to it, and for himself to break free of the constant cycle of death and rebirth, which he and just about everybody else in his day accepted as fact. After he achieved this insight, he began to teach others, and a community formed around his ideas. And in particular, they agreed on what are known as the 4 truths of Buddhism. First, life is suffering. Second, suffering has a cause, as it depends on attachment. Third, attachment can be interrupted, which prevents suffering in the future. And fourth, the way to end attachment is to practice the Eightfold Path. Now, right away, you might object to the first truth. After all, life is full of really nice things like friends and family, good food, hobbies, beauty. But the Milindapañha itself, quoting an early Buddhist text, tells us in what sense life is full of suffering or pain. It says, sorrow is painful, and so is lamentation, and pain and grief and despair. Association with the unpleasant is painful, and separation from the pleasant. The death of a mother is painful, or of a father, or a brother, or a sister, or a son, or a wife, or of any relative. Painful is the ruin of one's family, and the suffering of disease, and the loss of wealth, and declining goodness, and the loss of insight. And the text goes on for a long time, counting up the many ways that life can involve suffering. It compares birth, death, and rebirth to a raging stream of water flowing from the Himalayas to the Ganges, going over rocks, whirlpools, and tree branches. These obstructions are inevitable, just like suffering is in life. Any good or pleasant thing will end. And big or small, this fact of change results in suffering. Even the Buddha, when he lived as a prince in a beautiful palace, he couldn't avoid suffering forever. So there's suffering, which is just pain, that is anything which hurts or feels bad, but there's also existential suffering, which comes about from change and our attachment to things, our wanting them to stay the same. And that, according to Buddhism, is the sort which is really pernicious. Now, although I've been speaking about a general idea of Buddhism, in reality, there are many Buddhisms, different philosophical and religious understandings of the Buddha's teaching. The Buddhism that we encounter in this text is known as Abhidharma, which is an early form of Buddhism that emphasized the importance of the monastic life as a way of ending suffering, along with the study of metaphysical categories. And that's because monks and nuns who renounce ordinary life can spend a great deal of time focusing on living correctly and studying the Buddha's words about the way the world really is. As we saw, these monastic folks spent time doing chores like sweeping. But let me take a moment to briefly say what they did not do a lot of. That's what we call today mindfulness meditation. While meditation is described in early Buddhist texts, as well as attention on the breath and a whole lot of other contemplative practices, what we are familiar with as mindfulness today wasn't their main focus. Here's one scholar explaining how meditation worked in early Buddhism. Part of meditation involved not only dismantling the cultural conditioning of the broader social imaginary, that is, the ideas of the broader world, but also reconditioning and habituating thoughts, senses, emotions, and sensibilities to experience the world within the categories of the Dharma. The word Dharma is important here. It refers to the Buddha's teaching. In Sanskrit, dharma can have the sense of duty or obligation, but it also has the sense of a way or what is right. The Eightfold Path I mentioned earlier included ways of acting rightly in order to remove attachment to sense objects and to prevent suffering. Meditation was one part of this practice, but it wasn't the only one, and it was part of a larger set of ideas. One of these ideas, which is really important, is that of a skanda, which means heap. Our Buddhist Abhidharma metaphysicians thought that understanding what the world really is like could help us stop being attached to it. As a child, once you learn that the monster under your bed doesn't exist, you stop being afraid. And as adults, once we learn there is no self, we can stop being attached to it. All that exists is skandhas, which together collect into a heap. Here's another metaphor. You wouldn't be attached to a sandcastle as if it were a real castle. All that it is a heap of sand, made up of lots of small particles, and the ocean will wash it away in due course. Likewise, all that the world is and all that we are is a collective heap of stuff, which will wash away and change in due course. Now, there are 5 skandhas. There are physical components. There are feeling experiences of pleasure, pain, and indifference. There are sensory experiences of objects, like their shapes, their colors, and so on. There is volition, which are things like our desires, our emotions, our motivations. And there's our consciousness of our experiences, which is an awareness of what's happening in our mental life. Now, this heap of skandhas is also called name and form, which you see in the Milindapañha in many places. Form refers to the first skandha, that is, rupa or physical components. And name refers to the other 4, since they're things we can only name. In other words, they don't have visible forms, but we can just talk about them. We can infer that they exist. Now, Abhidharma philosophers argue that everything that exists can be analyzed in terms of various groupings of these 5 categories. For example, as you watch this lecture, at one moment you have a sensory experience of the laptop. That sensory experience involves hearing sounds and seeing sights. The laptop is made up of physical components that have shape and color and dimension. And you yourself are made up of physical components, including biological ones. But as we analyze the situation, we find we can explain everything in each moment without any appeal to some mysterious thing called the self. And here's the kicker, these skandhas aren't permanent. Material stuff decays and changes. Experiences, volitions, and consciousness comes and goes. From moment to moment, there's nothing that continues the same. One experience causes another experience. The existence of physical components that make up your laptop are the conditions for our experience to arise. All we have then is a set of conditions and cause and effect. Something like a complex sequence of balls bouncing off of each other, but there's no eternal, insubstantial self. So all we need to explain the world is skandhas and cause and effect, or karma. Karma is just the law that causes bring about effects regularly. A blue physical object brings about the sensory experience of blueness. A painful experience brings about the desire, the volition to avoid the pain. But we can't stop here because I've only given you a theory and told you how it might work. I haven't given an argument for why you should believe it. And that is what our main character, Nagasena, is supposed to do. We see this in the text. After the chariot argument, and yes, we will get there, I promise, the king is impressed and asks Nagasena if he'll continue to discuss with him. Nagasena, though, sets a condition. They have to discuss as a scholar or as a pandit, not as a king would discuss. And this is an important distinction. That's because kings and other powerful people don't discuss. They tell people what to think, and if there's disagreement, well, then off with their head. But the threat of punishment is not a reason to believe something. Pandits, however, discuss differently. The word pandita in Sanskrit is used in masculine and feminine, by the way. There were women pandits. And pandits, what they do is set up what they'll argue by introducing a thesis, the winding up. They engage in argumentation, the unraveling. And at the end, somebody in the discussion should realize they were wrong about something. The goal isn't to keep whatever beliefs you already have. It's to come to know the truth. And importantly, a good discussion is not just about logical method. It's about your attitude. It's about your emotions. When someone makes a distinction or criticizes your view, you don't get angry. That's because even if you lose the argument, you will have won something. You will have learned a new thing. This method of reasoning was very important in Indian philosophy, not just for Buddhists. Debate was a kind of spectacle in pre-modern India, where people would watch arguments between members of competing religious groups for entertainment, and things were at stake, like money and power. And we know that King Milinda was an excellent debater and he enjoyed winning. But unless he agrees to debate for the truth, Nagasena won't continue to speak with him. You might think about this a little bit in our age of online debate and constant discourse about controversial topics. Is it always the right thing to engage in debate? Remember, as a Buddhist monk, Nagasena is committed to the Eightfold Path, one component of which is right speech. Let's turn to the details of that speech now, starting with the famous chariot argument.